Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're looking at DDR4 memory performance with the new Ryzen 5000 series, because that's pretty much all anyone is asking for at the moment. But before we go in search of Zen 3's memory sweet spot, there are a few other things that I'd like to talk about. And the first order of business is 2 modules versus 4 modules, a topic recently brought up by Gamers Nexus. Now, just to be clear, before I continue, I have no issue with the GN video. This isn't shots fired at GN. I am friends with Steve, we talk regularly, and we actually spoke shortly after his video went live. What I'd like to do here is provide a little more information, some more context perhaps, as to what this means in the AMD versus Intel battle, because a lot of people seem to have misunderstood the testing, and I guess without representation of Zen 2 and Comet Lake CPUs, that is easy enough to do. Coming away from that video, many viewers, as evidenced by the comments section on our recent Ryzen 5 5600X review, they took the GN findings to mean that AMD's Zen 3 processors were much faster relative to competing processors when using 4 memory modules, opposed to having just 2, and frankly that is just not the case. This is something we'd actually investigated quite recently, 11 months ago now in fact, when I compared the Core i9 9900K and Ryzen 9 3900X using 2 8GB modules versus 4 4GB modules using the exact same memory timings. I found when using rather slow DDR4 3000CL16 memory that we were almost always looking at a 3 to 5% performance uplift for the average frame rate at 1080p using an RTX 2080 Ti, but also gains as high as 10% when looking at the 1% low results, and this was seen with both the AMD and Intel processors. Certainly not massive gains, but as I said, this is relatively slow memory, and I expected that the margins would grow a little bit with faster memory. But before we jump into my updated testing, here's a very brief explanation as to why 4 sticks can be faster than 2. It boils down to how the memory is configured, or rather the memory rank. For those of you unaware, the term rank means the number of 64-bit memory banks on a module. Most consumer-grade memory features a single rank, though higher capacity modules are usually dual rank, while server-grade memory is often quad rank. Identifying if your memory is dual or single rank can be difficult, as software doesn't always read modules correctly, and not all memory manufacturers note the rank in their module's ID. Typically, single rank modules feature all the memory chips on one side of the PCB, while dual rank memory places chips on both sides of the PCB. However, that's not always the case. A module with chips on both sides of the PCB is really just dual-sided and can still be a single ranked module, so it is a bit confusing. Where things get even more confusing is when you introduce more memory sticks or modules. A system populated with more than 2 single rank modules will actually act as if dual rank modules are installed. In fact, there is very little difference between 1 dual rank module and 2 single rank modules when connected to the same memory controller, even though the memory chips reside on different PCBs. So, when using 2 single ranked modules for dual rank operation, the memory is configured as a single rank. However, when using 4 single rank modules for dual channel operation, the memory is now configured as dual rank. This can give the 4 DIMM module configuration an advantage, as it allows several open DRAM pages in each rank. Although the ranks can't be accessed simultaneously, they can be accessed independently, and this means the controller can send write data to one rank while it waits for the read data previously selected from another rank, and as you'll see soon, this greatly increases memory bandwidth. How much of an impact this has on performance depends on the application and the memory controller's ability to take advantage of open pages. But what all this means is, yes, it is possible for 4 modules to improve performance over 2 modules in a dual channel system. Okay, so using the GeForce RTX 3090, here is how the Ryzen 9 5900X, Ryzen 9 3900X, and Core i9 10900K compare with 2 DDR4 3200 modules versus 4 DDR4 3200 modules, all using the exact same timings. I've only tested with 2 games here, as that's really all the data we need to clear up any misconceptions you might have regarding 4 sticks with Zen 3 versus other CPUs. Testing with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is a very CPU demanding game, we find that the 3900X saw a 14% increase in the average frame rate when going from 2 modules to 4, and that's a very significant improvement, though note we are using an extreme GPU at a low resolution. Anyway, moving to the Core i9 10900K, we again see a big performance uplift by using 4 sticks, this time a 15% performance boost. Now with the Ryzen 9 5900X, we're looking at a very similar performance increase, this time 12%, and it's possible we're starting to run into a GPU limitation here, as Ampere scales quite poorly at 1080p. But the point is, all three CPUs see a similar double-digit performance uplift with 4 sticks. So this isn't some kind of special feature that's unique to Zen 3. Hitman 2 is another CPU/memory sensitive game, though it's kind of a weird title. Anyway, that doesn't really matter, and since we are looking to be GPU bound with the 5900X, let's focus on the 1% low data for this comparison. With the 3900X, we're looking at an 8% performance increase with 4 sticks. However, using the 10900K, that shows a far more significant 29% performance increase, though it's only a 13% increase for the average frame rate. Like I said, Hitman 2 is a bit of an oddity, and I suspect with the 3900X we're looking at a performance bottleneck that's more related to the core-to-core latency rather than DRAM performance. Anyway, with the 5900X, we're also witnessing a massive increase in 1% low performance with 4 sticks, this time a 21% performance boost. But again, I think we're running into a GPU limitation for the average frame rate. But the point is here, the 10900K and 5900X see a similar increase to performance with 4 memory modules, so not a feature that's unique to Zen 3. Okay, so moving on, it's now time to check out how the Zen 3 architecture behaves using different memory modules, frequencies, and timings. And once again, I will be using the RTX 3090 for this next batch of results, but I do have some data with slower GPUs to go over later in the video. Now, at this point in time, none of my Ryzen 5000 series processors work with a 2000 MHz FCLK, which does limit me to using DDR4 3800 memory. Well, I can use faster memory, but not at a 1-to-1 ratio. Apparently, there will be new BIOSes that make the 2000 MHz FCLK more likely, though I have tried one of said BIOSes and it didn't help in my case. The good news being, though, that all of the CPUs did work at 1900 MHz, and that certainly wasn't the case with my Zen 2 processors, with some working but most not. Limiting them to 1800 MHz as the maximum FCLK. Now, for much of this testing, I've used G-Skill's Trident Z 3600 CL14 memory, which I manually tuned, raising the CL to 16, but aggressively tightening the secondary and tertiary timings, which does massively improve performance for all Ryzen processors when heavily CPU limited. This configuration will be tested at DDR4 4000, 3800, 3600, and then an underclocked 3000 configuration as well. I've also included some stock XMP memory configurations as well, one using Corsair's Dominator Platinum RGB DDR4 3600 CL18 1919 memory, and another using AIDA's XPG Spectrix D50 DDR4 3600 CL18 2020, but with 2 different configurations, one using 2 dual rank modules and the other using 2 single rank modules. I'm also including our G-Skill Trident Z DDR4 3200 CL14 4x8GB test configuration used in our reviews, and I'll also add in a 2x8GB configuration as well for single rank testing. I've also done my best to label this data in the graphs, and I get that for some of you it will be a little bit confusing, but you are free to pause at any point to get your bearings. Finally, I'm sticking with the Ryzen 9 5900X, though please note these results apply to all Zen 3 processors, even the Ryzen 5 5600X. Okay, so first up we have Death Stranding, a game where the Zen 3 processors went like a bat out of hell, and despite that, this isn't a particularly memory sensitive title. For example, if you compare our review configuration using 4 DDR4 3200 CL14 memory modules, cranking the memory up to 3800 with tightly tuned memory timings only boosted performance by 3 FPS, so a 1.3% increase. Moreover, we're only looking at a 7 to 10% difference between the fastest and slowest memory configurations tested, which really isn't that significant. It also looks like, at least in this title, that dual-rank DDR4 3600 CL18 memory is comparable to our dual-rank DDR4 3200 CL14 test configuration. Moving on to F1 2020, here we're again seeing very little in the way of a performance uplift over our test system configuration, which is marked as orange on the graph. When using manually tuned DDR4 3800 memory, this time we're seeing just a 5% performance discrepancy between the fastest and slowest memory configurations tested. Therefore, F1 2020 is another game that isn't particularly sensitive to memory performance. Okay, so we know from previous testing that Far Cry New Dawn is a memory sensitive game, particularly latency sensitive, and here we're seeing quite a notable 12% performance gain with the tuned DDR4 3800 memory over our 3200 test configuration. That said, if we take the same 3800 spec but just increase the frequency to DDR4 4000, which right now in the absence of 2000 MHz FCLK support decouples from a 1-to-1 ratio with the Infinity Fabric. And doing so actually breaks performance a little bit, dropping down to the tuned 3600 spec. Horizon Zero Dawn, like F1 2020 and Death Stranding, isn't particularly sensitive to memory, as here we're again looking at just a 5% difference between the fastest and slowest memory used. There's also little to no difference between single and dual rank memory configurations in this title. Yet another game that isn't heavily influenced by memory performance is Rainbow Six Siege. In fact, here we're looking at less than a 2% performance discrepancy between the fastest and slowest memory tested, so not much else to talk about here really. Memory performance does make a reasonable difference in Watch Dogs Legion. Here we're looking at a 6% performance increase by just adding 2 more DDR4 3200 modules. And we see by overclocking and tuning the memory that performance was increased by a further 3%. Certainly not something that'll prove beneficial at the higher, more GPU-limited resolutions, but it is a measurable difference when testing with a CPU-limited scenario. As seen earlier, Hitman 2 is very memory and CPU intensive, and here tuning up your memory can make quite a big difference. Though again, that will only be the case when performance is CPU limited. Here we're seeing that performance using the stock DDR4 3600CL18 kits, like the Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB or AIDA64 Spectrix D50, in a single rank configuration, it's pretty horrible relative to what we see with the dual rank or manually tuned configurations. Quite shockingly, we're looking at around a 23% reduction in 1% low performance. Also, if we look at the DDR4 3200 configurations using 2 and 4 sticks, we see that our 4-stick configuration would be up to 17% slower if we removed 2 of the modules. We're also seeing the Spectrix D50 16GB DDR4 3600 modules offering a nice performance boost, as they were 6% faster than our 3200CL14 test configuration. And again, this is dual rank memory. So the power of dual rank operation is strong here, and unfortunately I was not able to test the manually tuned DDR4 3800 configuration in a dual rank mode, as I don't have enough of those modules. So in Hitman, with the memory at or above the 3200 spec, we're seeing up to a 21% difference in performance and up to a 12% increase over our test configuration. That said, if we increase the resolution to 1440p, the 21% margin seen previously at 1080p is reduced to 14%, which is still quite a big margin, but it is heavily reduced by increasing the GPU load. Moreover, whereas the manually tuned DDR4 3800 memory was 12% faster than our DDR4 3200 test configuration at 1080p, here at 1440p it's just 4% faster. Still, as you can see, dual rank memory does make a huge difference in this title. Like Hitman 2, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very CPU demanding game that's also very sensitive to memory performance. Looking at our test configuration, we see that using 4 of these Trident Z DDR4 3200CL14 memory modules improved performance by a whopping 12% when compared to just 2 modules. It's also faster than the single-ranked DDR4 3600CL18 configuration as well. And we're looking at similar performance from the AIDA64 Spectrix D50 32GB DDR4 3600 kit, and of course that performance uplift isn't due to the extra capacity, but rather the dual-rank configuration. Beyond that though, we're not really gaining much with the manually tuned DDR4 3600 and 3800 memory. I also ran some 1440p tests with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this is what I believe you can expect to see in most games, even with something as extreme as an RTX 3090. Whereas we did see a 19% difference between the fastest and slowest tested configurations at 1080p, 1440p that margin is reduced to just 4%, and with memory running at or above the AMD base spec, we're talking about just a 0.7% difference. Now, if we average the 1080p data seen across the 8 games tested, this paints a pretty clear picture of the kind of performance differences you can typically expect to see with an extreme GPU at a lowish resolution. So, in more CPU-limited gaming scenarios, a manually tuned DDR4 3800 configuration will net you around 7% more performance when compared to a stock memory kit, like the Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB for example. When compared to our review setup, we're looking at just a 3% boost on average. And for those of you wondering, here's a look at the memory bandwidth performance of these various memory configurations. Although the performance of DDR4 4000 was quite average, given we couldn't run at a 2000 MHz FCLK, the bandwidth is still very impressive, sustaining 55 GB per second. The manually tuned DDR4 3800 memory managed 53 GB per second, which wasn't that much faster than the AIDA Spectrix 32GB kit, which achieved almost 52 GB per second. Our test configuration was good for almost 47 gigabytes per second, which is about the most you can hope for from DDR4 3200 memory, running in a dual channel configuration. Now, here's why the 55GB DDR4 4000 configuration didn't dominate the gaming benchmarks. The latency is rather unimpressive at 60 nanoseconds, and that's only marginally better than our DDR4 3200 test setup. The manually tuned DDR4 3800 memory reduced DRAM latency by 9%, hence why it did so well in memory-sensitive titles such as Hitman 2, Far Cry New Dawn, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Speaking of Hitman 2, here's a look at memory frequency scaling. So we're using the same memory and timings, with the only changes being made to the memory frequency and the FCLK, which has been kept at a 1:1 ratio for optimal performance, with the exception of the DDR4 4000 configuration, for reasons just mentioned. In Hitman 2, we see fairly consistent scaling as the memory bandwidth and/or latency is improved, right up to DDR4 3800. I expect if we could get a 2000 MHz FCLK working, you'd see a further 3% boost for the DDR4 4000 configuration. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a little more in line with other demanding titles, and here we find that DDR4 3600 is the sweet spot, and this was the case with Zen 2 as well. So for those of you wanting as much performance as possible without going overboard on memory prices, in my estimation, DDR4 3600 CL16 looks like the way to go. But wait, there is more. Here's a look at the same memory configuration just seen in the scaling benchmarks with the RTX 3090, redone again, but this time with an RTX 2070 Super. As you can see, even in Hitman at 1080p, with an RTX 2070 Super, you're going to be almost entirely GPU bound, and if you happen to be gaming at 1440p, you'll be entirely GPU bound, and no matter how much money you spend on your memory or how many modules you have, performance is going to be much the same. And we see exactly the same thing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Even at 1080p, we're looking at equivalent performance across the board due to a strong GPU bottleneck, and the 2070 Super's no slouch. We're talking about Radeon RX 5700 XT-like performance here, so a very solid mid-range GPU. Of course, increasing the resolution only neutralizes the results further, and now it doesn't matter if you're running DDR4 2800 or 3800, performance will be very much the same even in a CPU-demanding title. So, in conclusion, if you're just a gamer wanting to maximize performance if and when you'll run into any sort of CPU limited situations, and you really just want the maximum bang for your buck, then I do recommend getting DDR4 3600 CL16 memory, and for the most part I suspect 16GB will be fine, but if you can't afford it, of course 32GB is a nice luxury to have, and it means if you purchase two 16GB kits you'll also have the advantage of dual ranked operation. Right now, something like Crucial's Ballistic 16GB DDR4 3600 CL16 kit looks like a great deal, as it costs just $75 US, and should you want to, they will offer a high degree of tunability. G-Skill also offers an affordable Ripjaws DDR4 3600 CL16 kit for around $80 US. Now, assuming that I was able to get a 2000 MHz FCLK working, and perhaps I will be able to with future BIOS revisions, I really don't think it's worth spending over $100 US on those kits. Chances are you'll never spot the difference, namely because there probably won't be a difference. So that stuff should really be reserved for overclockers wanting to get bigger 3D Mark scores or whatever leaderboard it is that gets them excited these days. As for the 2 sticks versus 4 sticks thing, yeah, look, nothing new to report on since our testing 11 months ago. The performance uplift for Zen 3 is no different to that of Zen 2, or competing Intel processors, at least in games. Some games will favour Zen 3 more, while others Intel, just the way it is. The margins will also depend on the quality settings used and of course the hardware. So if you lower the quality settings in these games, you're going to exaggerate the margins further, and that does get you further away from reality for most gamers. I realize that most of you would just install your memory and get gaming, and frankly, unless you enjoy playing around with this stuff, spending hours tuning and tinkering with memory timings for what likely will amount to very little or potentially even no real-world gains, it's just a waste of time. This is important stuff for us reviewers trying to conduct scientific testing, and sometimes we do get a bit carried away with isolating a specific component in order to see what the performance differences might be. But it really is important to remind viewers that for the most part, they're unlikely to see these gains under realistic gaming conditions. So keep that in mind. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If you appreciated this video, give it one of those. The like thing, you can also subscribe for more content. We'll have an IPC video coming up soon, and then There's some new GPUs just around the corner. Also, if you'd like to become part of the Hardware Unboxed community, join us over on Patreon or Floatplane. Links for those are in the video description. Floatplane now gives you early access to our content. This video would have gone up earlier on Floatplane. Basically, we can do that because there's no YouTube algorithm thing to worry about, so we don't have to upload at regular intervals. So anyway, that's a nice feature for those wanting to sign up on Floatplane. Alternatively, we have Patreon as well. But yeah, you can decide which one of those you want to use, and yeah, I'll leave that to you guys if you are interested. But as I said, that is going to do it for this one. So I would like to thank you very much for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.